welcome back. Jared here, wishing you a happy holiday season. If you're currently in an MFA program, I hope you enjoy your time away from school. If you're anything like me, you need it. And if you're applying to programs this cycle, congrats on any applications you submitted at the big December 15th deadline. It was 3 years ago now that I went through that whole process, but I can still remember the stress of putting together my portfolio and the relief of finally being done. So congratulations and good luck. And for all of you, either in MFA programs or about to be, I hope you'll keep tuning in to MFA Writers. My hope is for this podcast to be not only a resource for people applying, but a database of what programs around the country are doing so we can continue to make this industry more transparent and equitable for all of you who have put so much time and money into it. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. Feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. We love to hear from listeners. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Cordis Paldano. Cordis is a third-year MFA student at Minnesota State University. Before that, he was a theater artist who studied acting at the French National Academy of Drama in Paris. He's performed in over 25 plays in India and France. He co-founded a theater company in Pondicherry. And in 2018, he published a children's novel with Hachette India. Today, Cordis is going to read a couple of poems for us.
My love and I. My love and I are inventing a new language to speak to one another. For the one we had died this summer. Don't ask how, it had a stroke, and no, we didn't expect it either. Well, it was frail, and the day was hot, and we'd have called for help, but we'd been taught to wait it out. And so we did, and now it lies on our living room couch, decomposing. So we are inventing a new language, my love and I, for we haven't spoken, my love and I, in a while. Song for K. Roses bloom in this valley even in the dead of winter. Bloom from everywhere, the cracks on walls, the turrets of abandoned tanks, the trunks of men whose bodies lie in a pile at the bottom of the ravine, where it gets so cold that all winter the flesh doesn't rot, so you can look down and see their faces, frozen with the same expression they had at the moment they were shot. Mouths, eyes, wide open at the mountains and blue sky above, while clouds float by and all the roses sway in the breeze.
Cordis, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for reading it. Thanks for being here. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Thank you, Jared, for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you too.
So, your background is in acting. As I've said before, you've been in over 25 plays. You've written and published a children's novel. Your focus at Minnesota State is in fiction, and you read poetry for us today. So have you always had such a wide range of interests as an artist?
Yeah, so I think it's got to do with my background in acting, where each play brings with it its own set of requirements. One play might require me to perform martial arts, another might require me to do aerial silks, another might require me to sing on stage. And so I think actors know how to pick up a little bit of everything that they do. So my theater director used to say that a good actor is a jack of all trades, master of none. So I think that's where it comes from.
So I'm curious then about your childhood, your upbringing. Like, were you raised around the arts? What was that like?
I wasn't raised around the arts, and it's also complicated in India. My parents, they were typical middle-class Indian family, and so they always expected me to become an engineer. And I think all through school, I too kind of I too thought I would become an engineer. And then something happened at the age of 18, 19, and I rebelled. And in my head, at least, it's also got to do with the loss of faith for some strange reason. And it drove a wedge because my family is deeply Catholic, and it drove a wedge between me and my family. And rejecting the teachings of the church for me made it easier to reject the other dogma that undergirded the middle class Indian family experience. And then I moved away completely from that track. And I didn't go to college. I started doing theater with a group of young people, and we had a theater company of our own. So that's what I did for most of my adult life.
I was going to ask, like, how did you end up doing acting? So it was like after this moment of rebellion where you're like, I don't want to be an engineer. I'm going to go do stage acting. I love that that's your choice, by the way. That is a fantastic way of rebelling. I love it. So, like, where did you go? You said you moved away to do theater acting. Where did you end up?
So this is what happened. So I was supposed to go to engineering school, and I was supposed to sit for all these entrance exams, and I trained for it. And I think for about 4 or 5 months, I did it seriously. And then my heart wasn't in it anymore. And my parents were worried about me. And they decided that, okay, if the kid doesn't want to be an engineer, something really must be wrong with him. So they took me to see a therapist. And the therapist was kind. And he said, okay, it's obvious that this kid likes languages. Why don't you just let him study language? And here's the funny thing. When I used to love reading as a child, but about the age of 14, I stopped completely because my parents actively discouraged it. And it's not because it's because they wanted the best for me. There's this belief widespread in India that anything apart from academics will ruin your child's future. So I was in the school soccer team. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't read anymore. So I met with this therapist, and he said, okay, you seem to have got good scores in French, so why don't you study French? And there are lots of opportunities. You could find a job in French. And I already spoke a little bit of French. And so I studied French, and all of a sudden I could see that my parents were encouraging, because if I read literature in French, they thought of it as work. I wasn't reading for pleasure according to them, but I was. So I became proficient in French, and I met this young theater director who'd just come back from France. He was of Indian origin, but he held a French passport, and he wanted to start a theater company in India. His name is Kumaran Vallavan, and he still does amazing work in India. And so we started a theater company together, and it was the beginning of a grand adventure for me.
Yeah, that's amazing. So then connect the dots for me. Like, how did you end up from there in the French National Academy of Drama in Paris?
Oh, yeah. So we started our theater company, and we were in this really small town, and we were performing in villages nearby often. And we would go to the big cities to perform now and then. And we went to the big cities. I got some awards for acting. The theater company got some awards. And then I got the scholarship to go study acting at the French National Academy. And so that's how that happened.
So tell me about that experience. Like, how old were you at the time? What was it like moving to Paris to study acting?
Yeah, so I got 2 scholarships to go to France. The first was when I was younger, about 20. And then to study at the French National Academy, I got it pretty late when I was 26. And I spoke French fluently both times. So because I've often bumped into Americans in France, and the experience of France has been so different from mine, partially because most of them did not speak the language. But I had a great time in France. I think in my artistic journey, the biggest impact that studying in that school has done for me is that it was a paradigm shift, because in India, theater was marginalized, really in the margins, and there's a sense of shame attached to being an actor. It's considered, it's even considered, I'd say, immoral in some sense.
Really?
Yeah, and I think there's nothing wrong with it. That's how I think the acting profession was considered in Europe too, in the 16th, 17th centuries, where actors were not allowed to be buried alongside in the cemetery. They were not accorded a Christian burial. So for me, to see theater be at the center stage, Paris, for example, there were 5,000 shows every night. So that was it really energized me to do art, to continue pursuing art.
So at what point did you start writing? Is it something that you were like doing at the same time that you were acting? Was it something you did as a kid, or was this something you came to later?
Yeah, it's something I came to later. I think I always wanted to write, but I never quite knew how to go about it. And for my theater company, I've written a little bit, just some scenes here and there. And then at 29, I went to university for the first time. So I was in university for a year. And then at the end of the year, a lot of the students got placed in companies, but I didn't sit for any job interviews because I decided that I'm going to burn all the bridges. I'm going to write. So I went back home near Pondicherry. I rented a small place near Pondicherry. It was like $25 a month, the rent. And so I was living there, and I didn't know that I was going to write a children's novel, but that's what came out. And I sent it to a professor that I'd met at this university, and he helped me get it published. He helped me get a publishing contract like right away, a couple of months later.
Yeah, your children's novel, which you published in 2018, The Dwarf, the Girl, and the Holy Goat, is published with Hachette India. I was going to ask, how did that come about? How long did the process take to write the book? Was it your first attempt at a children's novel? And how did you end up with Hachette India?
Yeah, so when I look back now, I'm not quite sure how it happened, because I think back then when I wrote it, I was 29, 30, and I had no idea what POV was. I didn't know what tone was. And I think I reduced the complexity in my life to the only thing that I had in my life was writing. I didn't even have a cell phone. I just went out to eat, and then I came back and I wrote. And it took me a month and a half to produce the first draft. And then I spent 10 days revising it. And I sent it out, and it was picked up by Hachette India, and it sold pretty well. It's got good reviews. So
you're like a superhero. You're making me feel bad about my writing. You wrote an entire novel in a month and a half, revised it in 10 days, got it published, and it sells well. I mean, whatever you're eating and drinking, I want some of it. Okay.
No, but when I think about it, it makes me feel bad about my writing right now. So.
Well, you also told me that you think about writing as a form of spiritual practice. And so I wanted to hear you talk about that more. Coming from that religious background, I'm curious what it is about writing that you find spiritual, and if it's maybe replaced that thing that you left behind.
Yeah, so I think theater for me was clearly a spiritual practice, and I'm trying to do the same with my writing, but I don't think I'm there yet. But there is this yearning for, man, I don't know how to put it, for your work to be the purpose of your life. But I think when I did theater, it was clear to me that theater offered so many spiritual experiences, so many transcendent experiences. When you're inhabited by a character, I've had such moments in my writing, but those are few and far between. So I think that's where I'm trying to head, but it's difficult. But I continue to be fascinated by religion in my fiction, which is a totally different game. Yeah. But I think one of the reasons I want a spiritual approach to writing is because I feel like whenever the task is difficult or when the odds of you succeeding are very low, I think it makes sense to turn it into a spiritual pursuit. That makes it more meaningful. It makes it less frustrating.
I love that idea of transcendence and the way that performance art, when you have a character, you're really like transcending your own life and becoming this other person. And I agree with you that the goal, I think, of writing fiction is to try to do that, is to try to like fully understand someone whose experience has been different from yourself, right? I always say that, like, to me, fiction is an act of empathy, right? It's trying to understand the lives and struggles of your characters, and it makes you hopefully a better person in the process. So what have you learned from inhabiting a character and acting that you think maybe we can apply to fiction?
Yeah, I think the one notable way in which acting is different from writing is that acting is purely artistic, whereas I think writing is artistic and intellectual. I mean, theater could be intellectual too, but actors don't have to do the job. That's the job of the director, the playwright. So I think when you are writing fiction, you are simultaneously inhabiting the characters you're dramatizing their lives, but you're also setting the scene for them. So I think writing that way is more difficult. And maybe another way in which writing is different and frustrating, for me at least, is that I miss the camaraderie of theater. Theater is a group adventure, whereas writing, it's so lonely. It's such a lonely job.
Yeah, it's a solitary art, right? Which is, one of the reasons that I was drawn to writing and writing fiction in particular is it's so available. All you need is like a pencil and paper or a computer. You don't need a stage. You don't need a cast. I think about my brother who's a filmmaker and all of the other people and the equipment that goes into like doing his art, where I get to just sit down in front of a computer, right? And write something. But you lose that camaraderie. You don't have those other people around.
When I was younger, I used to think the reason I do art is to get the love of others. In a way, I feel like that's why everyone does whatever they do. Buy a new car, buy a big house, become an engineer, to get the love of parents, get the love of friends. And so for me, producing a good work, a good story, or being good on stage, it's a way of justifying existence. It's like, I think maybe because of I didn't have a very happy childhood. So for me, I can't take life for granted. So it seems to me like if I produce something beautiful, it's like, okay, humanity deserves to exist because it has produced such good stories. It's produced these works of art.
One of the most beautiful things about art in general, writing specifically, is this ability that it gives you to take trauma and turn it into something beautiful. Once you have that feeling, right? Once you've done that, you just want to keep coming back for more. You want that feeling again. And, whether that is things from your own life, traumas for your own life, or you told me before the interview that politics is something that you think about when you're writing fiction. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so my first novel, I wrote it, and the protagonist, she is threatened by this mob, and I didn't think much of it. But I think my second manuscript, I finished the manuscripts for 3 children's novels. The other 2 haven't been published. But all of those had this pattern where the individual is threatened by some group. There's the threat of violence, and after coming here to the MFA program, I think all of my short stories, there's always this threat of the group threatening the individual. It always hangs over the characters like the sword of Damocles. And so now I'm beginning to think about it. I'm trying to understand my fixation with this collective violence. And I'm beginning to think it's because I'm kind of a Hobbesian. I'm really paranoid about, partly because I grew up as a minority in my country, and I think I'm paranoid about groups always threatening the rights of the individual. And I think, it's not particular to India. I think I'm always worried about the Hindu right wing in India, but I'm also worried about fundamentalists here in the US. And I think I'm just slightly paranoid about majorities. and I think it shows in my work.
So how do you think living on 3 continents studying art has affected your worldview and your writing?
Yeah, so I think I never quite understood India till I left it. And I think that's the point of traveling. You've lived elsewhere and you understand your own country, your own roots better once you've stepped out of those 4 walls and looked in. And I love India, and I think all of everything I'm doing is trying to understand this place that I'm from, these people that I grew up with, and trying to make sense of it, and then dramatize it in a good story, hopefully.
Well, that's what I try to do as well, and I completely agree. Once I left my hometown, suddenly it became this like incredibly fascinating muse for my work. I wanted to try to understand the people I had grown up with, who were wonderful, great people, but also viewed the world in a completely different way than I did in many ways. And I wanted to understand how those 2 things are coming together to create the person that I am. And also talking about political violence and how that's something that's on your mind when you're writing. I often think about, why are the vast majority of these violent crimes, especially in this country, perpetrated by people who look like me, right? White males. Like, where is this violence coming from? And what is it about my background that could cause someone else who looks like me to do these violent things? And I don't know, maybe as writers, as artists, we need those kind of questions that really, I mean, to be honest, don't have an answer, and we'll never find an answer. But somehow the process of trying anyway, trying to find an answer is beneficial to our work.
Yeah, what you said resonates deeply with me, because I think a lot of my work has been interrogating toxic masculinity in India. Why do people who look like me, and in the end, all these people whom we label as monsters, they're like us. They're not that different. So what in the environment, or what triggered them? What makes them do that way? And I think I agree with you that curiosity to understand the source of evil too, because I think people seem to think that evil is out there, people who are not like them, who commit acts of evil. But I mean, I've known people who've committed acts of evil, and it seems to me like it's good people with good intentions who end up committing evil. And so I think, and as you pointed out, one of the jobs of fiction is to make the reader empathize with that person who they think does not inhabit the same moral domain as they do.
So after your days of acting on 2 continents, you decided to move to a third and study fiction in Minnesota State University's MFA program, which is a 3-year program with tracks in fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry. You describe yourself as an outsider to academia, having not attended university until the age of 29. So tell us about your experience entering school at that age and how you ended up in Minnesota pursuing an MFA.
Yeah, so I left my theater company, went to school to a good university near Delhi. I got a scholarship to go there for a year to study liberal arts. And over there, I met someone on the bus. I knew who the person was. He was a published writer, but he didn't know me. And we got talking, and he told me that he had gone to this MFA program here in Mankato. And that's how I knew about it. And if I hadn't met him that day, I wouldn't have applied. And I also mentioned another professor that I met there, Shoykot Majumdar, who mentored me in my writing, and he wrote me a recommendation letter. And this writer, Aruni Kashyap, who I met on the bus, he wrote me another recommendation letter, and that's how I ended up here in Mankato. If not, I'd still be in some corner of India, I think.
Well, what do you think have been the positives and negatives of being an older student in the MFA program at Mankato?
I'm not sure about the negatives. I'm not sure. I think the positive is that I think because I see this sometimes in students who do 4 years of undergrad and then enter university, they look at assignments like it's a drudgery. Whereas for me, it's exciting. Every assignment is like, it's an opportunity to learn. So I think that curiosity has remained fresh in me because I didn't go to university. So that's the big positive. The negative maybe is that I haven't read as much as my peers have. And I think when I talk, it's not structured, because I think you have to learn. You have to be initiated into those forms of speaking, which I haven't yet done. But I'm looking forward to, and it's been a great ride so far these past 2.5 years. And I've loved it. Yeah.
What do you mean when you say like forms of speaking?
I think where I'm from, when people talk, they don't talk linearly. They talk in a cyclical manner. They'll start a subject and they'll jump to another topic and to another and to another. And to the listener, it makes sense because I'm used to that. I'm used to listening. But over here, I think people really talk in a linear manner, and it's neater you could say it's neater. And I mean, it's like a story structure. Instead of meandering, it builds up to a climax.
Well, I was going to ask, do you find that like coming from a place where people speak in that circular manner that you just described, do you think that affects the way that you think about stories and the way you structure stories compared to your peers in the program who speak in a more linear way as you described?
I think the biggest influence on how I see stories comes from my background in theater. And so mine is very conventional, Aristotelian. I think of stories and I think I used to think a lot about plot, but I think the MFA program has actually helped me meander more in my writings. It's helped me focus less on plot and think more about what does the character want to do.
Well, although you're a fiction candidate, you read poetry for us at the start of this episode. So does Minnesota State encourage work in genres outside of your focus?
Yes, so the program at Minnesota State is highly flexible. You needn't even decide what your focus is until it's time to choose your advisor. So you could spend your first 3 semesters taking workshops in poetry, playwriting if you want to, short fiction, novel, and then you could make a decision about what you want your focus to be.
So what would you say that you've learned from other genres like poetry that you've applied to your fiction or vice versa?
Sure. So I didn't know much about CNF. I took a CNF workshop that helped me a lot. And I think I love CNF. I love writing CNF. And I think I did not understand the field at all before I'd taken the workshop. So that has helped me frame arguments. I mean, before setting out to write, CNF taught me to be aware of what the heart is before you write about it. And poetry, I think, has helped me become more sensitive to English, because I think I'm sensitive to language, just not to the English language. So poetry has helped me to listen carefully. It's helped me develop my ear for English better.
I'm taking a creative nonfiction course this semester for the first time. And so it's been interesting for me too, to see how it's affected my fiction and how I think about it. Because like you said, in creative nonfiction, it's different than fiction. In fiction, at least in my experience, I go into a story not really knowing what it's about and like trying to figure that out through the process of writing. Where in creative nonfiction, like you said, you kind of know what the heart of the story is. You have this kind of question that you go in with, and then you're exploring that through the writing. And it's been really interesting. I didn't expect there to be as much exploration possible in creative nonfiction. But it's been really interesting to see the things that come up that I didn't expect. Was that the case for you when you were writing CNF?
I agree. It's almost, I think before joining the MFA program, I think I was an egocentric writer, by which what I mean is that when I wrote a text, I assumed that people would understand what I'm saying. When in fact, you have to, as a writer, I think it's your responsibility to make sure that they understand it. And so I think the CNF workshop in particular helped me be clearer. And I totally agree with you. It's meaning is not created. I mean, I said you have to know the heart of what you're writing, but the heart's also discovered gradually through as you write multiple drafts.
Yeah, like you have that idea, that question, that meaning that you're thinking about. What I didn't expect was to see that heart of the story, as you describe it, evolving through the process of writing it. And so getting to the end and finding that like this idea that I had that I thought I was exploring, I've learned something completely different about it that I wouldn't have if I hadn't sat down and put the words on the page.
And another parallel that I would draw is that for me, the heart of my artistic work is short fiction. And I feel like everything else that I'm doing, all these forays into CNF and poetry, ultimately it's about becoming a better short story writer. And it's helped a lot.
Well, I want to give a shout out real quick to one of your classmates, a longtime listener of the podcast, Ailee Slater. Ailee reached out to me a while back about doing an episode on MSU, and she's the one who suggested reaching out to you for an interview. So I just wanted to say thanks to Ailee for being such a great fan of the show and a supportive classmate. Ailee described the program as the proud underdogs of the MFA world, small and scrappy with strong funding, amazingly supportive professors, and a real thirst for experimentation. So I was wondering if we could go through each of those things that Ailee said and get your thoughts on them.
Sure. First, my thoughts on Ailee. Ailee is wonderful. I love Ailee. I love her energy and all that she brings to the classroom.
So first, Ailee mentions strong funding. It was hard for me to tell from the program's website just how many students are funded. So do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, almost all students are funded. So in that sense, funding is strong. But the stipend is good enough for Mankato. But Mankato is not an expensive city.
So how much is the stipend?
The stipend is $10,000 a year.
Okay.
There are some MFA candidates who work on the side to support themselves, but I haven't been doing that.
So pretty much everyone in the program is funded, it sounds like, which is great. I mean, like what we want is more programs to be quote unquote fully funded, which means every student gets funding to attend these programs. But, $10,000 isn't like a particularly high amount for a stipend. But in Mankato, I imagine the cost of living is pretty low. Have you found that you've been able to get by like on 10,000?
Yeah. So, I mean, the advantage, Mankato is pretty cheap, but so that's an advantage. And nothing much happens in Mankato. So, I mean, I guess that's the reason MFA programs are at home in the Midwest. Nothing much happens. It's good for your writing life.
So from what I could tell on the website, the funding is attached to a teaching assistantship. So are you teaching in the program?
I am. So the first year, my funding didn't come from the English department. I was teaching French. So even if you don't get funding from the English department, there's an array of opportunities for you. You could, if teaching's not your cup of tea, you could work in marketing. You could work as an intern, and there are a lot of opportunities. You could. One of my friends, for example, she heads marketing for the Good Thunder Festival, which brings in writers from around the world to Mankato. And another friend, for example, she works in the anthropology department, grading papers for a professor. Another works in the film department. So it's, if you want funding, you'll get it at Mankato.
So in each of those positions, is the funding including a tuition remission as well as a stipend, or are you just getting a stipend with those positions?
So Minnesota State offers the standard package to all graduate assistants, 9 credits of tuition waiver per semester and $10,000 a year.
So what's the workload like when you're teaching, when you have a teaching assistantship at MSU?
It really depends on whether you have a teaching experience or not, because I think I struggled a lot in my first semester, just trying to figure out the curriculum and trying to figure out what the students' expectations are. But what I've noticed is that workload dips in the second and third semester. But if you're going to be teaching composition at MSU, then you're looking at a class of 25 students, and it's pretty flexible. And after you've taken some courses in comp theory, you're allowed to design your own curriculum, so you can have fun with it. Yeah. And my boss is highly supportive. Dr. Kelly Moland, who runs the writing program, she's supportive, very flexible, very kind. So
are you just teaching one class per semester or more than one?
Just one section per semester.
Okay. And next, Ailee mentioned amazingly supportive professors. So you said that the coordinator of the teachers is very supportive. Can you tell us a bit about your relationship with the creative writing professors? In your experience, are they pretty supportive to students?
Yeah, so they are incredibly supportive. I came to the MFA program here partly because I'd read the work of Jeff Herbeck, who had also mentored the professor who recommended me here. So Jeff has written young adult novels. He's published about, I think, 9 books. But I've never taken a class with him because he was chair of the English department, so I can't talk about his teaching abilities. But the other professors have been incredible too. Chris McCormick, he's a novelist. He's been a great mentor to all the students. And Robin Becker, she's on a sabbatical now. She's smart, witty. So the professors are incredibly kind, always there for you. They always pay close attention to everything that you write, and they're very nurturing. And so the professors are really, for me, the reason you should come to Mankato.
Great. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. That's really what you want, is that mentorship, that community. And Ailee also mentioned that the program has a thirst for experimentation. So in what ways do you see the program fostering experimentation?
They're very open and they're very flexible. So they don't care much about genre. So in the same writing workshop, someone could turn in a literary fiction short story, and someone else would write a science fiction short story. And I think that's both a strength, because it's good for your artistic imagination to know that your peers are working in diverse genres. But I think sometimes in the feedback process, sometimes because everyone doesn't share the same expectations for the written work, sometimes I've noted that it can be a drawback too.
based on my correspondence with Ailee, it seems there's a strong sense of community amongst the students in the MFA program. So have you found that to be the case amongst your cohort and the other students in the program?
For sure. Students are very kind and they've been very generous. And yeah, we meet up a lot. And there's a sense that we're all in the same boat, that we're all struggling against the same monsters. And yeah, so that there is a good spirit, a good vibe among the students, a great sense of community. And we have some credit for it should go to the professors too, because they, for example, there was a couple, Rick and Candace, they just retired during the pandemic, but they'd always have students over for Thanksgiving, for other events. So some of the credit goes to professors and some of the credit also goes to, I think it's in the nature of, I think that's why you go to an MFA program, for that sense of community, because the rest of your writing life is one long, lonely ride, as we spoke about.
Well, you mentioned that Mankato, there's not a lot to do there. It's a pretty small town. I think the population's like 40,000 people. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about Mankato, your experience living there, and what you and your fellow students do there.
Sure. So we meet up quite often, a couple of times a week, and one of my professors has been saying this often this week in particular. He says, in a short story, if the character, language, and plot, all three cannot be complicated. If you decide for two of them to be very complicated, the third has to be very simple. He gives the example of Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway, where the plot is so simple, she's just heading out to get flowers, but the characters are complex and language is complex. So I think he said it about fiction, Chris McCormick, he said it about fiction, but I think it holds true for life too. If you have a writing life, I think it makes sense to keep your work life and your social life simple. And I think Mankato has been a blessing that way. It really allows you to focus on fiction.
And then you also mentioned earlier the Good Thunder reading series. I saw on the website that there are actually two reading series, that one and the Writer's Block open reading series. So can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure. So the Good Thunder reading series aims to bring world-class writers to Mankato, and it's really the highlight of the MFA program because you get to meet these writers in person. They do workshops with you, and then they do a craft talk and they do a reading, and later in the evening you can hang out with them. And the Writer's Block is quite different. It's student run. So Writer's Block, professors read that work too, but it's mostly for students and by students.
And how often do readers come to Mankato for the Good Thunder series, and how often do you do the student run series?
Yeah, so both of these happen once a month.
Oh, wow. So there's a new writer coming to campus every month?
A great writer coming to campus every month, yeah.
Wow, that's really great. Yeah, a lot of programs have these kind of reading series, but from what I can tell, they might have a writer, like one writer a semester come, or maybe two writers a semester, but once a month, that's great.
Sure. Yeah, so after the pandemic, I think the funding was cut. And so this year alone, they've had only 2 writers per semester, but it's expected to go back.
Well, Cordis, it's been wonderful chatting with you. I mean, your background in acting is so unique, and it's been so cool to hear you talk about that in relation to fiction, and then to hear what you all are doing in Mankato. It sounds like a really interesting program. So before we go, I want to give you the last word. And what I usually ask guests is, what is one thing that you think the program does really well? And what's one thing that you think that they can improve?
The one thing the program does really well is the faculty. I've been quite clear about it. The faculty is supportive, nurturing, always there for you. And they're really good at what they do. So that's the one thing the program does well. And one thing they could improve, maybe perhaps the stipend. I don't know. I've been able to make ends meet, and I'll be gone next year. So it's not about me, but I feel like some of the writers who are coming in, I feel like maybe they deserve more. So because one of them said the stipend hadn't gone up since 2007 when they'd done another master's at this university. So I really hope the stipend eventually goes up, because otherwise they won't get the writers they want. And that would be a pity, because it's a really good program.
Well, Cordis, again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me and share your experience and share about the MFA program at Minnesota State. It all sounds great.
Thanks, Jared, for having me. It was fun talking to you.